Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Max Bergmann. I am the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program and the Stuart Center here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It is a real honor to have the event today and to be working with my good friend Jean-Marc Lieberherr and the Jean Monnet Institute to put on this event. Elections will be taking place on both sides of the Atlantic this year, both in Europe and here in the United States, if you haven't noticed. Throughout the last few months, the strength of transatlantic unity has been in question, and there are big outstanding questions about what will elections mean for the alliance, for the U.S. and European economic engagements and economic relations, and also the future of Ukraine. What will our elections mean for all of these subjects? And so we thought it would make sense to convene an esteemed panel here today to discuss these issues. And the other aspect of this election, we tend to focus on the U.S. election, is the elections that are taking place in a few weeks in Europe. We in the United States, I think, have tended to not really track or follow what is happening when it comes to European parliamentary elections, yet this will have a real impact on the future of Europe. And we at CSIS have recently launched a new project on the future of Europe to study these trends. Where Europe is today is not where Europe was 5, 10, or 20 years ago. We're celebrating 20 years of the Big Bang enlargement, where the EU finally expanded eastward and almost effectively united the continent. There's still, I think, more to do there. But studying where Europe is headed is incredibly important. It's work that we hope to do here at CSIS. So here to discuss, we have three excellent panel of experts who I will introduce in a moment. But before I do that, let me hand the floor over to Jean-Marc Lieberherr, the chairman of the Jean Monnet Institute, to provide some opening remarks before we dive into the discussion. Jean-Marc.
Thank you very much, Max. Thanks to all of you for being here. As Max said, my name is Jean-Marc Lieberherr. I'm the president and co-founder of the Jean Monnet Institute, and we're very pleased to co-host this event today. Our institute is called after a Frenchman, Jean Monnet, who happened to be my grandfather. Well, that's not a coincidence. I created this institute. And Jean Monnet devoted his whole life to uniting people and building lasting peace in Europe. He's best known for having inspired the coal and steel community in 1950, which was the first European community and the ancestor to our current European Union. Consider that in 1950, only 5 years after the end of the Third War that had opposed Germany and France in just 8 years, the former enemies, together with 4 other European countries, decided to join their destinies. They did so in the most astonishing manner by turning the very resources that had pitched them against one another into a common good managed by all jointly for the benefit of all, coal and steel. They turned the destiny of Europe within effectively a few months. It was an incredibly audacious bet that kick-started one of the most successful and ambitious human endeavors of modern times. In just 70 years, just as many years as it took for France and Germany to go to war 3 times, we are now 27 members who've committed to resolving their conflict peacefully. We exchange goods, services, we circulate freely, we share a common currency, we pledge mutual support, and we make a common commitment to upholding the rule of law. And yes, we've lost Britain, but isn't that a sign of a free community if you can live it? And for one who left, 10 are desperate to come in. The United States have played a critical role, as you know, in this incredible European adventure. Many of the greatest American leaders of the 20th century, Presidents Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy, just to name 3, recognized early the importance of supporting this peaceful revolution that happened on the other side of the Atlantic. And it's no coincidence that Jean Monnet, after whom we're named, knew them all very well. He'd worked with Roosevelt here in Washington during the Victory Program, and Roosevelt had gotten to trust him. He'd met President Eisenhower in North Africa during the war, and then 10 years later he convinced him to support the European defense community, which unfortunately never happened. As for Kennedy, who called Monnet the statesman of the world, they shared the same vision of an equal partnership between the US and Europe, built on common values. Today, as we'll certainly discuss it, our Europe is at crossroad, and with it our transatlantic partnership and probably the West, as Putin calls it with disdain. An existential challenge as existential challenges build up at an unprecedented pace at our doorsteps. We've come to realize as a community our vulnerability and the need for a European Union to transform itself. Monnet's fundamental belief was that Europe's strength would come from its ability not just to coordinate between members, but to act as one. And it's fair to say that as we grew larger and exponentially more complex, we did not necessarily adapt our roles so that we could do that precisely, act as one. In simple terms, which I'm sure some of our panelists will challenge, instead of building power as we build size, we created many inefficiencies and as many frustrations. So let me just give you a few examples that I think will resonate with you. In the EU, 40 telecom operators share 450 million users, when in the US, 3 main operators cater for 330 million users. So it's 1 for 10 in the US against the EU. The same goes for our defense systems. We've got 146 different systems in the EU, when you've got just 34 in the US. So not only do we deal with more complexity, but we also invest a lot less as a community in our technology and defense, for example, because we do not yet have the financial instruments to do it at EU level. So that gets us to the European elections and the growth of the national votes, which I'm sure we'll touch on. Whenever established authorities are seen as unable to address populations' expectations, the nationalist vote grows. And that happens under the dangerous illusion that national solutions will succeed where European solutions failed. It's an illusion. And the only way for Europeans to respond to this illusion, as recently proposed by Mario Draghi, a former Italian PM and European Central Bank head, is to trigger a radical transformation of the magnitude of that was triggered by Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman in 1950 with the coal and steel community. Like it was after the war, this transformation is in the US interest, so it can rely on a solid, independent partner who can look after itself and take its share of the common load. It includes, of course, defending Europe against our enemies and promoting our shared values of freedom and democracy. I want to thank Ambassador Neliupšienė, Dr. Karen Donfried, and Walter Goetz, who are much better informed than I will ever be on all these questions, for accepting to be with us and share their perspectives on these questions at such a momentous time for our two peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marc. Now let me introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Ambassador Jovita Neliupšienė. Thank you so much, Ambassador. She is the Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, a position she assumed on January 1st of this year. So she's getting ready to experience our lovely weather in DC during the summers. Before that, she was Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania from September 2022, where she was responsible for the coordination of European affairs, European bilateral and regional issues, as well as national sanctions coordinator. We have Karen Donfried, the former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. In Washington speak, when we think of the Assistant Secretary for Europe, we say she ran Europe. And so she ran Europe effectively during the Biden administration. She recently left and has been with the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. And prior to becoming Assistant Secretary, she served as President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And she also used to work at the White House as well. Also to my right is Walter Goetz, is the head of the European Parliament Liaison Office, where he aims to strengthen U.S. and EU parliamentary ties by developing relationships with U.S. organizations and companies and identifying key legislative issues of mutual interest between the EU Parliament and the U.S. Congress, of which I think there are quite a few issues to discuss. And prior to his post in Washington, Walter was the head of Cabinet of Transport Commissioner since 2019. So maybe, Walter, we'll kick off the conversation to start with you, to maybe give us a background on what is actually happening in Europe on June 6th with the elections, and what's at stake, and what are the mechanics of how this all works. Because I think we've heard in Washington, 2024 is the year of elections around the world, in India, other places, but in Europe, we have 450 million people going to the polls. What does this mean? Maybe break it down for us somewhat.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Max. Let me first thank the CSIS and the Jean Monnet Institute for bringing the European Parliament elections to Washington, to our Washington US community here, because we are currently with our office doing quite a bit of outreach here in the United States to European citizens living in the United States, but also Americans who are interested in transatlantic relations, about what does it mean, the European Parliament elections in exactly 4 weeks' time, from the 6th to the 9th of June. We have 4 days election because it's quite a complex exercise to go to the ballot boxes in 27 member states. Some 450 million citizens, I think 360 million eligible voters in the European Union, which go to the votes according to national laws and vote for national parties, which then form later on the groups in the European Parliament. So we do some outreach here, and I'm grateful for having this discussion here. The European Parliament elections are insofar a global democracy exercise, I would say, because we, the European Parliament, is the only directly elected international parliament which legislates, which adopts legislation which is binding for its citizens and the courts and the enterprises in our 27 member states. That's a difference to a UN system or other international bodies who do international conventions or treaties but do not legislate. On top of it, the European Parliament is, of course, also the budget authority to adopt the budget for the European Union, its institutions. So it's of paramount importance to go to the vote and to participate in the European elections. What happens currently, we had a good week ago the last plenary session. The members of the European Parliament are now out for campaigning. We will elect 720 members of European Parliament. They are currently forming 7 groups in the European Parliament. We expect that the groups remain more or less to be stable in the composition, let's say, in the number of the groups, although that remains to be seen. And it depends now, of course, of the results of the European Parliament elections about where the directions of the next 5 years will go in the European Union. Why that? Because the European Parliament will then have, after the elections, a couple of weeks of forming groups and discussing political priorities. But then in July, we will elect a new president in the European Parliament and vice presidents and set up the committees again, as every parliament would do after elections. And as is currently the plan, in September, the European Parliament will vote then on the Commission President candidate, which is a vote which is quite significant because it's a secret vote and it needs the majority of the component members of the European Parliament to put a yes up for a presidential European Commission President's candidate. And then the European President candidate comes back to the Europe, first of all presents political priorities to the Parliament as a basis for that vote, and comes then some 2 months later or 3 months later, after the hearings which have taken place in the Parliament, with a college of commissioners, which leads to a second vote, then most likely somewhere in November, maybe in December, where the entire college of commissioners will be voted by the European Parliament into power. So you can see the European Parliament is, of course, key in setting up the European institutions. Then after every 5 years we have these elections, and the European Parliament will be decisive to shape the political priorities on substance for the next 5 years, which the Commission, as the guardian of the treaty, the executive arm, and with the right of initiative, also has then to execute. And this is all in the light of, I think I should then stop, and the ambassador will continue, all in the light of the current geopolitical threats, evidently from the war in Russia, in Ukraine, with this unprovoked aggression of Russia, the Middle East conflict, the geopolitical threats for our economic competition, or our also, let's say, democratic competition with new totalitarian systems emerging around the globe. I think a strong European Union with a high level of participation in our elections, with a clear result and a clear outcome of these elections, is of paramount importance for the European Union and for later on, of course, also for transatlantic relations.
Now, before turning to the ambassador, let me ask a few basic questions on how this operationally will work. So if in Germany, you don't really get to go and vote for Ursula von der Leyen or against Ursula von der Leyen as the next Commission President. How does the voting actually work on June 6th? Are you voting on a national level, European level?
No, you vote at national level. If you take the German example, the country I know best, we have lists, actually according to the 16 Bundesländer, we would have our party lists. So you have one cross to make, one vote, where you vote for a list, let's say CDU, which is EPP family, or the SD, which is the Social Democrats in Germany, and so on. We have some 35 parties on the list in Germany. And according to the vote cast and the results there, the members of the Germany would send the 96. We have 96 members from European Parliament in the European Parliament. They will then be according to the votes cast in these lists. So you cannot vote for a person, you vote for a group list in Germany. But we have 27 different election systems. This is not harmonized at European level. It can be different in Italy or in Ireland or in other countries. Yeah.
Great. Well, no, thank you. I think part of this is sort of fascinating for an American audience to think about how the voting mechanics and process work, given, sometimes our system is fairly straightforward and a two-party system and two choices, and the multi-level nature of European political dynamics. But Ambassador, I want to bring you in. So this has in some ways been a high watermark for U.S.-EU relations. I think we'll have Karen maybe comment a bit on U.S.-EU relations and the relationship between Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, and President Biden. But what is at stake for Europe? What are how significant are these European parliamentary elections, and maybe what are the topics that are being fought over, discussed, and how will Europe move in the next 5 years after these parliamentary elections? I know you don't have a crystal ball, and the outcomes, but what is sort of being debated and at stake, and how will this sort of help determine Europe's future direction?
Well, first of all, of course, it's like 360 million people voting, and to make it even more complicated, it's, for example, their age of the voters in countries may differ. Mm-hmm. We have more than 2 million people who would vote for the first time and who are of age 16, 17.
Yes, in Germany.
So it's really amazing system with the possibility actually to legislate and do a compulsory legislation. But I think that the vote is happening in a very specific geopolitical situation, and if I would be sitting not in the ambassadorial position but in the think tank, I would say it's a bit of when we have to be careful what you wish for, because the previous election when the EPP candidate for that time, the candidates when they run, and then Ursula von der Leyen was presenting her first political priorities. Mm-hmm. She said she wants to run a geopolitical commission. So you have to be very careful what you wish for, because now we have a geopolitical commission, actually, because we have really existential threat in Europe, and Russia's aggression in Ukraine was not only the wake-up call, just ideologically or just kind of a mindful exercise. No, it's actually there are a lot of things has changed in Europe, and first of all, the way how we think about ourselves. We kind of we Europeans, we are very critical. We like this, and we want to be this. We want to be more geopolitical. We want to be more political. We want to be really a global leader. Now we have a possibility for that, and we do. And the changes the EU as an institution have been going through is really pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. From really constituting our borders via the border guard, European border guard system, to really creating their financial instrument for their providing military, lethal assistance to Ukraine, which if we would be having this discussion before the previous elections, people would be saying, well, this ambassador is joking, it's never possible. And I would probably be here as well saying, no, it's not possible. And when you are facing the war of aggression on European continent, a lot of things are possible. And as Jean Monnet was quoted here, another idea of what our founding fathers, Schuman and Jean Monnet, was really believing in that through crisis. EU is created through crisis. So every crisis helps actually to more establish more what is EU about, and that we have to defend ourselves, that we have to really think about ourselves, that as the power. We are not soft power anymore. Mm-hmm. There are people who are not inside. They're really keen, actually, to join because there is no alternative. There is no alternative on European continent. There is no fence sitting anymore. You have to choose which side of history you are. So a lot of vote and discussion is related to that. It's in some countries there are more discussions on if the war is already tomorrow. If the war will come to NATO, yes, there are countries which actually have really full-fledged discussions on that. Definitely, in some other countries, they are which are a bit more distant from Ukraine or from Eastern European border. Discussions a bit more different, but they are still related with the war. Energy prices and energy situation. Mm. We kind of have been discussing within the EU for quite a long time that we have to have a proper energy infrastructure links. Their connections. But only now we understand that dependency or not diversification properly actually has a huge price, which we had to pay to pay, and still again coming back to the quote, through crisis you actually constitute yourself, you build your resilience. Definitely trade, how open we have to be, and where is our competitiveness, and of course this depending on the country to country, then it can boil down to do we have to trade with our neighbors, Balkans, what we do with China, what we do with Latin American countries, what we do, what kind of cooperation we can offer for African countries. So that's it's really. The elections, I would say, is driven by the really big foreign policy and national security issues, but then they go down with go down to the very national context, I would say, and the vote will be crucial. I hope that turnout will be as high as possible. Right now, if you ask the question, by the way, they asked the question before election, are you planning to participate? Around 70% of the people said that yes, which is higher than the last time in 2019. It was around 50%. Mm-hmm. So most probably, those big topics actually brings back people to vote.
Of course, 50% is not great for Europe.
Yeah,
for European national elections. It's pretty solid for an American election. Maybe let me ask you about one of the kind of contentious issues that is being discussed about the Green Deal in essentially Europe's leadership when it comes to climate change and environmental issues. There's been a lot of farmers' protests. it seems like this election may impact Europe's future leadership on environmental issues, particularly if the far right continues to gain seats, and it's been a bit more skeptical of a lot of the EU-wide legislation. How am I? You can feel free to attack the premise of the question. How do you think this election could impact Europe's leadership when it comes to climate change and addressing environmental issues?
It's not so black and white. I have to tell you. Yes, there are voices which say like, okay, that's the thing we have to do. Is the question how we do and how much it will cost and how we approach that cost. This is one part of the group which is, I would say, really the proper questions to ask. But there is another group of the countries which are surprisingly actually saying that the climate change, we have to tackle climate change, but the green transition has another element, is an element of their energy security, a security as such. For the countries which I know best, I can tell you, we don't have really what to drill. So that means that we have to invest in the renewables. And if you look at the eastern border of Europe, you would see that in most of the cases you would find more than 40% of the investments in renewables, and already in the energy mix. And that actually the awareness of your dependence on traditional fuels can actually cost you much more and really give a negative impact on your economy. Actually, help them to move further for their digital and green transition. So I would not. My guess is that EU would not lose definitely the driving seat in this double transition, but twin transition. But definitely the discussion of how to do that probably will be there.
Karen, I want to bring you in. I guess the larger question. Let's pretend the Europeans are not here. Does this election matter to the United States? Is this something that we should be paying attention to? Is this something folks in government are paying attention to? I feel like in the past this was sort of background noise in Washington of European parliamentary elections, but is this something we should be focused on a bit more than perhaps we have previously?
So I would not have accepted the invitation if I didn't think European Parliament elections mattered, but certainly most Americans are not tuned in. But why do they matter? Partly it's what Walter said, which is if the United States believes in democracy, this is the most significant exercise of democracy at the European level. You pointed out it's the only institution in the EU where you have direct elections. So it's how the citizens connect to the European Commission, the European Council. So just for that reason it matters. But it also, I think, many of us who follow Europe are paying close attention right now because of the expected outcome. And we haven't really talked about that yet. But if you look at public opinion surveys, it sure looks like the headline on June 10 will be the far right has made significant gains in the European Parliament. And that matters. So what we've seen over at least 2 elections is, and Walter talked about how, yes, these elections happen at national level in the 27 member states, but once these parliamentarians get to Brussels in the European Parliament, they're organized by groups. So they're not organized nationally. And for a long time, the 2 big groups have been the center right and the center left. And we've seen over the past couple of elections, support for those 2 big groups decline. So we're seeing across Europe a reduction in support for mainstream parties and an increase in support for extremist and in particular far-right parties. And that trend is going to continue next month in these European Parliament elections. And the concern isn't so much that the far right will be able to form some sort of super group and take over policy. I think there's an assumption that the center right will continue to be the largest group, and that'll give them an agenda-setting power. But the fragmentation we're seeing at European level, what I worry about is it could lead to a paralysis at exactly the moment where at least the Biden administration would like to see a more capable, more effective Europe. And Jovita said, look, the key issue is foreign and security policy because there's war on the European continent. And this is the challenge, because in the far right, you have some parties like Poland's Peace Party that is fiercely anti-Russian, but you have many parties in that coalition that are pro-Russian or soft on Russia. So it feels like the balance is shifting in Europe. And so that matters to us too.
Let me follow up with that. I mean, it strikes me, one of the headlines has been the far right have difficulty working with each other, you know, nationalist and a nationalist, and there's a lot of internal squabbling there. I guess when we, you know, one of the issues that has come up during this election, put forward by the EPP, the center right, by von der Leyen, is the notion of the EU doing more on defense, and the idea of having a defense commissioner in a second term, and the EU beginning to play more of a stronger military role, or a stronger role in defense. I guess it's a two-part question. So one, the far right emerging, are we, from a U.S. perspective, that's what you have your eye on, and so you're maybe not worried about the block of a cohesive block, but what issues are you kind of most concerned about that sort of upsetting in terms of the European agenda, the U.S. European agenda? And then maybe if you could comment on Europe doing a bit more on defense, or the EU doing more on defense, and the U.S. has sort of had one eye with a degree of skepticism. Of course, there is NATO and our strong attachment to NATO. How should we think about, should the EPP come out on top, the EU having a defense commissioner, there's been an EU defense industrial strategy. Is this a direction of travel that we're hoping Europe goes, or do we have concerns?
So, Max, I'm going to think about that as concerns about what does it mean if there's an increase in support for the far right in the European Parliament, and then sort of the role of the U.S. in all this. And I think I might start with your second point, because defense policy is one piece of it, but I think we have to be honest that our election is going to impact what happens in Europe. And I think it's very different for those far-right parties in the European Parliament if Joe Biden is reelected or if Donald Trump is elected. And I think if Donald Trump is reelected here in the United States, it will embolden those far-right parties in Europe, and they will feel they have a very important ally in Washington. And this connects directly to policy and what we mean when we talk about the far right in Europe. Because I'm struck, you know, a lot of times when you read articles about this, they'll talk about, you know, far right or right-wing parties are Eurosceptic. We'll see a sizable increase in the Eurosceptic parties. I don't think that's the right word. You know, think about a Viktor Orban. He doesn't want Hungary to leave the European Union. He wants Hungary to reshape the European Union. And he has a vision of an illiberal Christian democracy that should replace liberal democracy, which is what has dominated in Europe since the creation of the European Community and then the European Union. And that's very different. And, you know, if those forces become emboldened, that means something for U.S. interests as well, particularly if they have an ally in Washington. And this is where it's also, we should remember that the rotating presidency of the EU, who's going to take over that rotating presidency in July? Hungary. So if you have a European Parliament election in June, that sees presumably more support for these parties, then Viktor Orban steps into the presidency in July, and, you know, Viktor Orban, let's remember the things he's saying. down with Brussels, long live Europe. He's now talking about mega, make Europe great again, right? He's taking a playbook from Trump, make America great again. So he is just waiting for Donald Trump to come to power here. Because then the foreign and security policy piece looks very different. You know, a Europe that right now is very focused on supporting Ukraine, on a geopolitical commission. I mean, it's quite remarkable what's happened in the European Union over the past 2+ years of this war. And it's not that that all goes away, but it's challenged in a way we haven't seen to date. And if it's being challenged internally within Europe, and you have a Donald Trump elected here, I get very concerned about whether the balance of opinion in the European Union can continue to support Ukraine, help it push back against this Russian full-scale invasion, or if this becomes a very different picture in Europe as well. So that's the nightmare scenario, and we could talk about how likely that is or not, but I do think when we reflect on the implications of this, we should not assume everything is going to turn out well. We should think about how we prepare for that.
Well, I'm
Ambassador
happy. Yes,
Karen,
I'm
thank
happy.
you for
Yes,
providing an
Official
answer.
position, I got to be
I'm happy to hear that U.S. need to prepare for the European elections, but that's
all you liked about what I
yes,
said?
that's
Silver lining.
that makes us actually think about very important. I have two answers for those challenges you outlined. Yes, there are some trends in some EU countries out of 27 where the far right or far left is on the rise. But I see Walter actually got his numbers. So he mentioned the country he knows best is 96 members of parliament elected in Germany and 11 parliament members elected in Lithuania.
And 21 in Hungary.
70, I thought 17. Okay, 21 in Hungary. So, in order to have a group or faction in the parliament, which would be effective and effectively can undermine any kind of the decision, it has to be substantial. It never happened before, and definitely I'm not really very much sure if it may happen here, because even if you think, and you mention, for example, in Poland we have a substantial support for peace, or in Hungary, if it's really enough to form the group which can undermine the decision. But this is Walter's file; he can dwell on that. I have another kind of another side of the argument. With all due respect to the parliament and to the elections, the commission president is nominated by the heads of state and government in the European Council. There is a major game, as you can imagine, in the European Council, which they have to nominate other leaders of the EU institution, European Council president, HRVP, who acts like a foreign minister, and definitely there will be another game in the European Parliament itself to nominate the Speaker of the European Parliament. So all in all, you will have really a major play of the political parties, first of all, but as well a geographical balance in that. When it, so the budget of the EU is done for 7 years, and it's not being reviewed until the 2027. So whatever is promised for Ukraine, whatever is promised for defense industry strategy, whatever is committed for Green Deal is already there. So yes, you can look through, you can try to adjust rules, but the budget is agreed, and there was never, ever, and it will not happen that the budget would be open. It's just a different way of structure because it's really unanimity, and none of the countries would like to open the budget. And we just get a review, was reviewed in the parliament just recently. So there are, some challenges which can actually come with a little bit bigger fragmentation than we have right now in the European Parliament. But in general policy continuity, I really strongly believe it will be there. And I cannot really definitely dwell on answer if really a current president will be renominated, supported and then voted in the European Parliament. But in general, the major political parties, and there are actually 3 of them, because in our case liberals are somewhere in the middle, not on the left. So it's like, so we'll see how the Greens will be doing, but more or less 3 or 4 party coalition, and this is the major difference. We always build a coalition, and then within the coalition it's a bit less for the radical ends of their political spectrums to have an influence.
Walter, let me bring you in.
Yeah, just a few comments in addition to what Ambassador just quite rightly said. Give you one concrete example, the Green Deal, which was mentioned. This is all legislation. We have done the Fit for 55 package, is a set of 20-25 pieces which are binding. That's legislation. If ever, even if a completely anti-Green Deal party would win the majority of the House, which will never be the case, they need the European Commission to make a legislative proposal. The Parliament cannot change itself the Green Deal now. So we have also quite a good deal of checks and balance. On the one hand, the member states nominating the Commission President, proposing Commission President, and later on the Commission having the right of initiative. But I would like to say now, as a European Parliament representative here, the European Parliament has a history of many decades now in compromise finding amongst different groups, and ranging from a left-wing spectrum to a right-wing spectrum. The 3 center-right and center-left groups which are currently in the Parliament, which is the EPP, the S&D, and the Renew Europe, form something like 60% of the majority in the European Parliament currently. And all our polls which we have do not reduce those 3 groups too much. They will not fall below 50%. So even if, then I did not count in yet the Greens, which are absolutely a pro-European group. The left group is to some extent is a pro-European group. Even the ECR group, which is not yet mentioned, is a very clear stance on Ukraine. I would say, Karen, a majority, anything between 60 to 70, 75% of the European Parliament at least, will be pro-Ukraine and against Russia, will be pro-internal market, will be in favor of the euro currency, the euro will be in favor of rules of law and for the values which we represent. So I'm not worried about a situation like we have compared now in the United States of America, with a House which is obstructed by a very tight majority, with a bipartisan system where the winner takes it all. All these groups share the committee chairs, they share rapporteurship, they work collectively on legislation, they are used to compromise. We are compromising Parliament. However, Karen, I don't want to reduce the alarm which you have set here that we have to be vigilant. First of all, the elections have to be free of misinformation and foreign interference, and the people have to make the choice on the basis on facts and the correct information. And secondly, political things can indeed change. I mean, we had some votes in the last months on Green Deal, to take another example, like the CO2 standards for cars or the nature preservation in the agriculture field, which had very tight majorities in the European Parliament. And those majorities, that remains to be seen, might not be given anymore. However, that's not something which in the democracy is very alarming. I mean, in the end, people make now their choices. As long as what I said, the majority remains pro-European, pro-Ukraine, and pro-internal market, and pro the European system as such, I'm not too worried. I'm not too worried on this. Very much in line with what Ambassador just explained. I agree with you that we need to be vigilant on the radical political spectrum.
I mean, it sort of strikes me that in the U.S. we have elections that oftentimes result in divided government, where then we just decide, well, we're not actually going to be able to accomplish much legislatively. that actually, there's this bizarre dissonance between the U.S. and Europe where we struggle to pass legislation. Europe passes a lot of legislation, and Europe may find itself in a situation where it's just simply harder to pass certain legislation, which may mean that in a crisis situation may be harder to respond. But this gets to, I think, Karen's point. Karen sort of brought in the elephant in the room, and it's time to introduce the elephant in the room of the U.S. election in November and how that may impact things in Europe. Because I think there is an interplay between U.S. and European elections. We put out an issue brief here at CSIS in part because we were getting asked nonstop about what does if Donald Trump is elected, what does it mean for the future of the Transatlantic Alliance? I won't get into that, but I'm curious for your thoughts on how the U.S. election will impact Europe and how Europeans are also thinking about that. But before going to the Europeans, I want to maybe turn it to you, Karen, to start.
Well, and look, I think the overarching point I was trying to make is I'm just not sure it's business as usual. And we can look at the past and people have figured out compromises, but this will now be the third election where we have seen the mainstream parties get less support and the extremes on both sides get more. And that's telling us something. And, yes, Hungary is small, but Germany, we'll see how well the AfD does. I think the AfD has been hurt by the most recent espionage. This was on the Chinese side, not the Russian side, but I think your caution about Chinese and Russian interference in these elections is important. So we'll see how the AfD does. France, of course, second largest. We all believe National Rally will have the largest number of members. It will beat Macron's Renaissance. Then you have Poland. So, we are seeing trends here that are real. And we also know that there is an interaction between European Parliament elections and national elections. Take Germany that you mentioned. You're going to have 3 state elections in September, where again, at the national level, they're all in the East. The AfD will be the largest party. They won't govern, fair enough. But so I think there's a trend here that we have to understand. And, to your point that, look, the budget is set. Got it. They don't have to approve a new budget to 2027. But my point is simply that I don't think the status quo is good enough. And you have huge ambitions in the European Union, rightly so. We don't know if von der Leyen will be reelected as European Commission president. It's good for her that the EP is likely to remain the largest group, but we know it's a little bit fraught. Okay. She has said, if I'm reelected, for the first time, I want to have a defense commissioner. We have to get serious about defense industrial production in Europe. So my concern isn't that the status quo won't be maintained. My concern is, can you achieve the ambitions that you have set out for yourselves? And there, 2027 doesn't feel that far away. So and again, I was sketching sort of the worst case scenario, but I always think we need to plan for that worst case scenario and think about how do we manage that and how do we try to consolidate gains and make sure we can stay on that course
even given these shifting political sands?
Well, definitely. I think that, as Walter mentioned, we are very vigilant on what is happening, because we know that a lot of gains which far left or far right is actually getting is because people are exposed to disinformation, foreign interference, and the really no fact-checking and all the whatever is around that. People do not trust some of the institutions, which is really bad. So all this there. I'm not really trying to downplay, but I'm just explaining that it's a bit more complicated, even if some of them are getting into the parliament. And you're rightly, of course, it very much depends who is nominated the commission president and who then is voted as the commission president to drive some of the policies kind of a forward as we have seen. But we have not to underestimate the power of the countries which are actually the decision makers in the European Council and then in the different council formations. If we really are serious, for example, about European Peace Facility, which right now provides the defense spending directly supported for Ukraine, but it could be used, of course, in other jurisdictions. This comes actually with unanimity and with money, because then it's an extra budget. Are we serious? Are we moving forward? I think yes. We are. Do we really need that? There is a separate European commissioner, for example. It would be better to have, but I think it can be done even without that. Do we have other things? We have to be serious on other security issues, like be it building energy resilience and investing, be it investment screening and making sure your economy is more. The other part, which probably will bring Max to other questions, is actually, in order to be strong and resilient, be it economic or geopolitically wise, you have to have allies standing strong next to you. This is what is extremely important. And if it will be the same. When the U.S. will have elections, we will be already over our elections. We will be in the moment of the parliamentarian hearings, actually, in the European Parliament. Most probably, whoever is nominated Commission President will be already voted, so it will be the question about voting and approving a whole Commission as the whole Commission package. So that would be a Will the elections in U.S. matters? For their political priorities, maybe. For the personalities of the commissioners, most probably not. But looking very, very pragmatic. But in general, the transatlantic cooperation is really on top of the agenda at the moment. It was, I can tell you, I'm in the EU more like in out, but in general since 2009 very actively. It was never ever so high on the EU agenda as it is right now, and I think that should be noted. So that's why we follow U.S. elections very thoroughly, and it's important not only because of it is important because of the geopolitical situation and Russia's war in Ukraine, but due to other related issues, be it transatlantic trade, be it technological cooperation, be it energy, you name it, everything in general. It's like 1.3 trillion a year, or 306 billions a day. This is the trade of EU and US. It's even difficult to imagine what those numbers actually, and more than 10 million jobs on both sides of Atlantic. It's huge. So I think that we should not underestimate the impact of each other's elections.
Let me just ask you to follow up about Ukraine, because it does strike me that we just had a political fight over Ukraine supplemental. How is Ukraine playing in the European parliamentary elections? It strikes me that it's not really, that there's sort of almost unanimity in support of Ukraine. There are parties that on the far right, but that perhaps the kind of energy price increases and other things that Europe experienced are leading to kind of an anti-incumbent feeling. So this is an election in France, for instance, where you can vote against, you can ding Macron at the ballot box. And so you're maybe not necessarily thinking about Ukraine in your opposition to an incumbent, but how is Ukraine playing in?
You take Prime Minister Meloni, and then you have the answer. So that's it's really almost unanimity and unanimous support for that, and even Prime Minister Orban said that he didn't want to come back to the world of Russia. So I think that's, more or less unanimous decision. And when it's the war just across your border and some of their kind of lost missiles flying over into your territory for 15 kilometers, or you are 500 kilometers from their actual warfare, or you were at the coast of the Black Sea, where you can actually see those missiles flying, it's a bit of the different kind of approach you can have. And you can go, if you Greece, you have an impact because of the shipping industry. If you're Finland, you rush to NATO. If you're, you can take any country actually, and you see the impact. So this is the existential for Europe. So it's not really the case. I can repeat the numbers, saying 150 billion euros, and the 96 of them were 96 billion already delivered. Out of new 54.5 already delivered. So we, even if EU sometimes is kind of portrayed as slow and stuck with their decision making, there's never ever in this organization managed to move in the lightning speed.
I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in a second. I want to ask one additional question. We tend to think of transatlantic relations purely and sort of oftentimes in the security realm. What will Trump's election mean for NATO? There's been a lot of talk there's been less talk, about the economic relationship between the U.S. and the European Union and how extensive it is. The ambassador just laid it out. Karen, do you think this is a source of kind of resilience for this, for NATO, for the U.S.-EU relationship, that essentially if there's going to be an economic fight between the U.S. and Europe, if Donald Trump does win and there's huge tariffs, I mean, that would be incredibly bad for both economies. So and I would think that this is a stabilizing factor in kind of broader relationship. I mean, it's a leading question, but curious for your thoughts on the importance of this economic relationship.
I mean, in fairness, we should talk about the other scenario too, which is, I believe, the scenario we will have, which is Joe Biden getting reelected. And I think what you've seen in the U.S.-European relationship over the past 2.5 years is so profound. I mean, we've been reminded of why the transatlantic relationship matters. If you had asked when Tony Blinken asked me to join the administration, did I think Russia was going to undertake a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, I would have said, no, I don't think so. But it happened, and there is war on the European continent. And yes, we've worked very closely together in that area, but you've also seen incredibly close cooperation with the European Union across so many other issue areas. And Ursula von der Leyen is at heart a transatlanticist. And there have been difficult issues like the Inflation Reduction Act, where we sit down and talk about it and say, okay, how do we manage this? And Joe Biden says, I didn't intend this to have a negative effect on European manufacturing, so let's figure out how we manage this. And I think that's a very different scenario where you'll see this shift in the European Parliament, but the forces that will be emboldened are not those forces. And there's incredible room for the U.S. and the European Union to do much more together going forward. So that's the promise of the relationship. That would be the flip side of the coin.
So let me then follow up to ask you, do you see a second Biden term? It seems like the first Biden administration, the first Biden term, which we're still in, which we're part of, really tried to kind of, or saw the U.S.-EU relationship as incredibly important and trying to build a relationship through the Trade and Technology Council and increased interaction at a very senior level. But that also seems to have sort of gotten stuck. Do you see sort of an increase in ambition for U.S.-EU relations in a second Biden term? How would you envision that?
Yes, I think you continue those initiatives, and you mentioned the Trade and Technology Council, and that's so important because if you want to pick a 21st century issue along with climate, surely it's technology, and how we manage that together is critically important. But I also think how the EU develops on the defense side is very important. And this is where there's an enormous opportunity for the European Union and NATO to work more closely together. And one issue we have to grapple with is the relationship between Turkey and Cyprus, because that has been the big block in NATO to moving this forward. And it also connects to the role of the United Kingdom. Okay, got it, Brexit, UK's not in the EU anymore, but the UK is the second most capable military in Europe. And so we have to figure that out, and that's why the NATO-EU relationship, I think, building that bridge, figuring out how we can cooperate more closely is so critical today.
And it seems that UK is about to have elections, the EU is having elections. Part of the Labour Party's agenda, as being outlined, is to try to improve relations with the EU, particularly in defense. So I think that is definitely going to be potentially an area to watch. Let me turn to the audience. If there are questions, please, here in the front. And please introduce yourselves and hopefully keep it to a question.
Livia Gachtaita. I would like to ask, what part has Russian influence operations, such as spreading misinformation and promoting pro-Russian agenda, played in the increase of far-right in Europe? And also, are there any measures that EU Parliament or EU itself is taking to address this challenge? Thank you.
Great question. There's been a lot of news about this. The EU's been taking a lot of action. I'm not sure. I think this is a question that can go to all three of our panelists, so who wants to jump in first?
Walter?
Well, I can only say this was recently in the news about a German AfD member, which is now under investigation, and this is taken very serious by the European Parliament and certainly also by the investigation authorities in Germany or elsewhere in Europe. On the concrete case, we have to see what comes out of it. But the European Parliament has since quite a long time a very vigilant policy in place to prevent foreign interference and disinformation in election. We give also our members of European Parliament assistance at hand in the way how they interact with social media and how they deal with staff and how they communicate, etc. So we have our IT alert mechanism and things in place, which doesn't mean that it cannot happen, but there certainly this is a top issue for us to prevent these kind of things. Evidently, there's never a watertight solution, and if someone falls off and hires someone, we had this Chinese issue now, and but I wouldn't say it's a systemic issue. I don't have information that's a systemic issue. I think it's more some individual cases which boil up, and in general terms, we try to prevent any kind of this interference.
So today is the day when the Media Freedom Act actually is, kicks in a practical application. This is one thing. Another thing is that almost a year ago, we have adopted Digital Service Act, which actually is legislation in order to prevent a systemic violation of disinformation, miscommunication, abuse of the platforms, and I'm sure you're aware that Commission actually launched the cases of part of it. The inquiry is actually related as well to transparency and accessibility of the third parties to electoral information as well. So, there are a lot of things which are happening. Not only educating voters or educating readers or media literacy, which is extremely important, but as well actually using the legal tools to prevent those cases.
Karen, I'm curious for your perspective on this, having been Assistant Secretary.
Well, I would just say, if we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, election interference, it's real. The Russians and the Chinese are really good at it, and we have to get better at it. And we have been working very closely with our European partners on this, and we just need to get better.
Yeah. I also recommend looking back at the 2019 EU parliamentary elections. The Visa scandal in Austria was one of the more profound and shocking scandals that brought down the Austrian government. There's also ones in Italy. So I think it's definitely an important issue to raise. Here in front, Dan.
Hi, Dan Kellerman, non-resident fellow here at CSIS and professor at Georgetown. And just picking up on the last question, even though we were discussing Media Freedom Act, some of the legislative steps, my question is thinking longer term, should the EU do more to regulate European Parliament elections? There is no EU Voting Rights Act. As you said, it's up to each of the countries to do it. And even the statute on European political parties, let's say, put it this way, some parties that are running in these elections maybe don't meet democratic criteria themselves. One would question even if they should be allowed to run. So, but more generally, do you think in the future the EU should enforce more common standards to prevent someone like Orban from manipulating elections and sending MEPs under those conditions?
I can take this. Well, the thing is that Council actually made a decision back in 2018 to have a new election law under the proposal of European Parliament, because this is a bit of the different kind of regulation, so it's a bit of a different initiative comes from the European Parliament. We agreed to look at that, and in order this would get into force, you have to have agreement of all member states. We lack 7. So I don't think that there would be any success of delving again into their new legislative, and it's of course very amusing in a way to hear from American citizens to ask for more regulations from EU. Usually I get the opposite.
You're the regulatory superpower.
Usually I get the opposite. But you know, I will be very careful in regulating what kind of political parties or trying to measure who is democratic or more or less democratic, because it's a really very sensible, very sensitive process. And I think that it's worth investing more in critical thinking and media literacy and in our tools we already have at hands, instead of trying, to measure the democratic level. We have a lot of NGOs who are doing the freedom indexes, where I think that exposing all the faults or informing about them, it's really the way ahead.
Walter, if you...
No, I just would add that at some point, at certain point, you would probably need to go in treaty changes also, and that's something which takes years to do and needs ratification, and it's a very long-term process. So it's not an easy, low-hanging fruit to change the national systems here.
Great. I think we may have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord, retired. You mentioned Europe's trade with the United States. How does Europe's trade with China compare to that, and what has the trend been?
It's the most newsworthy question of the session. Of course, Xi Jinping is, I think, is he in the Pyrenees right now? He's just visiting France.
I think he's in Serbia.
Now he's in Serbia.
On his way to Serbia. And then
accidental U.S. bombing.
The accidental, yes, 25 years ago.
So, yes, so we have a very clear policy on China. China is a competitor, adversary, and a partner. And I think that Ursula von der Leyen, Commission President, was very clear on the way forward, and her leadership was really very clear and very close to their American way, that we have to de-risk. We have to really be very clear which are their most important and the most strategic sectors we have, which we have to be clear, and where we have to be really on friendshoring or onshoring, or however you call it. So it's AI, it's quantum, it's semiconductors, and it's biotechnology, and those 4 sectors are the same as here. And I really believe that that you have to look at really tangible steps which have been taken by EU. So we usually would not go after the tariffs. But if you look at the trade defense instruments, The cases launched against EVs, cases launched against solar panels, cases just launched against the medical devices and the procurement market access. Sorry. So, there are really substantial things going on. So we should not underestimate, and we actually have a strategy how to proceed. In January, the end of January, Commission announced the economic security strategy, where there are 4 elements in there, strengthening investment screening mechanism, which will become really compulsory, because now it could be different on the different levels. And actually, European Court of Justice let us do that. So this is a good news. Continued discussion and probably a certain level of European approach on the export control. Then definitely first steps of the discussions of outbound control. I was even surprised that we actually put it in the written form. But this shows really the not shying away to do a complicated things. And last but not least, which you even not done in this country, is actually looking into how you protect your own research and innovation. Because you have a bit different system. We have a lot of money investing in the research and innovation through European instruments. So for us, it's maybe a bit easier to square this circle. So a lot of things are going on. So we, instead of looking only onto their headlines, we have really to look what is happening on the ground.
And Karen, maybe I'll just turn to you for a last word about your efforts to work with Europe when it came to China. And how do you see U.S., EU, China engagement?
I think it is really remarkable how much European policy toward China has changed over the past, let's say, 5 years. And, you saw changes bit by bit with the Belt and Road Initiative in Europe saying, maybe we don't want China buying up our strategic infrastructure like ports. And then we had Huawei and 5G. You had the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, which was concerning to Europe on human rights grounds. I mean, you had a variety of things that were happening, but the reality today is that China is posing a direct threat to European security through its support of Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. And I think all of those things together explain why you've seen this very substantial change in European policy. And to the ambassador's point, it means the U.S. and the European Union have been working hand in glove as we think about how do we manage this relationship that is hugely significant to both. We also have very significant trade with China. We have significant relationships on several levels. We have treaty allies in the region, which Europe does not. But I think the extent to which we have worked closely together, and you can see it even in the terminology, as you mentioned. We both talk about de-risking. We're not decoupling. I think it is really quite remarkable. And as we move deeper into the 21st century, I mean, this is the challenge for both of us. And I believe we've been very well served by the extent to which we've been able to cooperate closely on this.
Well, I want to thank you all. I want to thank Jean-Marc and the Jean Monnet Institute. Jean Monnet, obviously one of the godfathers or fathers of the European project. It strikes me that the European parliamentary elections will be also happening on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And actually, one of the fierce advocates for European integration was Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, who then, as president, pushed for the European defense community, although it failed, but pushed for European integration. It was a major part of U.S. policy and U.S. strategy after World War II, and Eisenhower was in no small part in advocating, and I think they would look at the 370 or up to 450 million people that may turn out to vote on European-wide elections on the 80th anniversary of D-Day and say, we accomplished something. So I want you to all please join me in thanking our panelists for being here today and for their outstanding contribution.